I never expected a $25 fine to become the kind of ordeal that rewrote my life. But there I was, standing in my living room, the crisp envelope from the Homeowner Association board, HOA, lying on the coffee table, and for the first time I felt the ground shift beneath me. The morning had begun like every other. I brewed my coffee, reviewed the mail, and sorted out errands for the day. The neighborhood was quiet, the trimmed lawns of our suburban enclave well kept, the birds chirping outside the window. I felt safe. After all, I had played by the rules. The letter said the HOA claimed I owed a $25 late fee for missing a single monthly payment. My heart sank, not for the amount, but for the fact that I didn't even realize a payment was missed. I was up to date, or so I thought. I flipped through my bank ledger, cross-checked my online records. Everything showed the payment cleared. Still, the HOA insisted. They threatened that the fine, if unresolved, could be escalated, legal fees, interest, and worst of all, the possibility of forced sale. The words auction and foreclosure loomed in small print. My hands gripped the table edge. This was happening to me. I paced the living room as the morning sun shifted across the hardwood floor. I called our neighborhood accountant, a neighbor who kindly helped several residents with tax questions. He confirmed my records matched mine. I had nothing outstanding. But this fine had slipped through some glitch, or worse, someone's agenda. I decided to respond, to appeal. I drafted a letter to the HOA, attaching proof of payment, requesting clarification. The letter went off with a tracking receipt, yet over the next week, I noticed subtle changes in the neighborhood atmosphere. The HOA board meetings, as always held in the community clubhouse, suddenly caught more tension. I bumped into Mary, our friendly next-door neighbor whom I'd known for years, and she dropped a guarded look. At the Tuesday meeting, I listened in as murmurs swirled. The board was complaining about delinquencies, about enforcing rules more stringently, as though a campaign had begun. The board president, someone I'd said hello to dozens of times, now looked distant and rigid. Then the next letter arrived. They claimed I failed to pay the fine despite their notice from days earlier. Interest had accrued, legal fees had been added. My property was at risk of being moved toward an auction. My pulse quickened. Auction. The word echoed. I had always prided myself on accepting community living, on paying dues, on being a good neighbor. Now I was being labeled delinquent, and somehow it felt targeted. I called the HOA office, asked to speak with someone. They directed me to collections, a cold voice that did not acknowledge my evidence. I asked, "What is the rule about auctions for tiny fines?" The representative read from a script. The HOA reserves the right to take action for any unpaid fees and in extreme cases may proceed to lien and sale. I cursed under my breath. This was extreme. I sat in my kitchen after the call, the letter in my hand, my coffee untouched. I stared out the window at the neatly trimmed hedge outside. The hedge had been my pride when I moved in. I had planted it. I thought, is this really how community associations should act? A $25 fee, auction threat. That's when I began digging. I requested the HOA governing documents, the bylaws, the rules for fines, the procedures for collection, the membership list. I reviewed them late into the night. What I found troubled me. The fine schedule allowed for modest fees, yes, but the auction provision required many steps. Certified notices, multiple opportunities to pay, clear violation of major rule, etc. A simple missed payment did not align with the auction process detailed. More, I noticed a rule that indicated the board must act equitably and cannot single out a homeowner arbitrarily. I underlined the clause in bold. Something didn't add up. I walked outside to get fresh air, looked at my house, polished by time and by my care, and thought, what kind of organization threatens me like this? I reached out to neighbors quietly. I mentioned the fine and eventual auction threat. Two neighbors looked at me wide-eyed. They, too, had received letters about obscure violations. Grass height 1 month, shrub shape another, driveway crack. The pattern was there. The HOA had suddenly ramped up enforcement and was handing out fines and threats like candy. I realized I was not alone. That night, I drafted a plan. I'd gather proof, document everything, request a meeting with the board, call for transparency. I felt a shift inside me. Fear had morphed into anger. Darker yet, a sense of solidarity. I started speaking with other homeowners one evening at the community pool. The mood had changed. People were whispering about power-hungry board members, overreach, selective enforcement. I heard one middle-aged man mention that his fine had ballooned for what he believed was a minor oversight, and when he paid, the HOA still insisted on additional administrative fees without evidence. As I listened, I realized the story echoed many of those viral HOA videos online, where the board levied outrageous fines or threatened sale for ridiculous reasons. I recognized the tone, the betraying arrogance. The HOA seemed less about community upkeep and more about extracting money. I resolved I would not allow my home, my sanctuary, to become collateral in their scheme. The following morning, I received yet another notice. In 10 days, the board would vote whether to recommend placing a lien on my property. If approved, the fine plus fees would be attached, paving the way towards sale. I read it twice. That same day, I parked outside the clubhouse when the board convened. I watched through the glass windows, suits, clipboards, somber faces. This was not the friendly gathering we once had. The board president looked authoritative, as though preparing for a showdown. I realized I had to escalate too. I collected my printouts, my payment receipt, bank log, the governing docs showing the required procedure, and a letter I'd drafted. I asked one neighbor to join me in going to the board meeting, even if we only listened. The evening arrived. Inside the room, homeowners filled the benches. The board started with delinquency report and enforcement agenda. I raised my hand when given a moment, showed the board my folder of evidence, without speaking, since I promised no dialogue. The president's expression flickered. I felt the energy shift. Later that night, on the drive home, I thought about how unsettling this was. A community that once felt safe, built on mutual respect, now felt like a battleground. My homeowner's heart pounded. I was no longer just a resident. I was a target. I glanced at the mailbox by the curb, blinking a red flag that cried for justice. In the shadows of suburban sameness, I saw a power shift. The HOA had triggered a chain reaction, and I was about to push back. The chapter closed with me turning off the front lights, stepping onto the porch, gazing at the quiet neighborhood. I held a meeting agenda in my hand, the board's motion looming for next week. Vote to recommend lien. My mind raced with questions. Would the board act fairly? Would I lose my house over $25 and someone's ambition? Or could I mobilize and protect not just my home, but the home of others? As the streetlights flickered on, I made a vow to myself. I would stop them cold. The week that followed felt like walking on a minefield. Every knock on the door, every rustle of mail through the slot made my stomach tighten. The vote to recommend a lien was scheduled for Friday evening, and until then, I lived in a strange limbo, not sure if my home, the place I'd built my memories in, would soon become a pawn in some bureaucratic game. Each morning, I checked the mailbox like clockwork. The letters kept coming, each one colder than the last. They no longer used polite phrasing. Instead, they spoke in legal terms. Delinquent, statutory rights, collection procedures. $25 had evolved into hundreds after they stacked on administrative fees, late interest, and something they called a processing charge. It didn't feel like administration anymore, it felt like punishment. Neighbors had started noticing too. People whispered during evening walks, quiet but furious. I wasn't the only one under fire. The elderly couple 2 houses down had been fined for having a faded garden gnome. A single mother across the street received a citation for a cracked driveway that had been there for years. None of this was about maintenance, it was control. I started gathering everything, every email, every letter, every notice with a date stamp. I made copies, organized them in labeled folders, and kept a digital backup. The more I compiled, the clearer the picture became. The HOA board wasn't just enforcing rules, they were weaponizing them. They had quietly amended sections of the bylaws months earlier, giving themselves more power to impose liens and accelerate penalties. The community had never voted on it. I knew because I attended those meetings, or rather, I used to, before they started private sessions for internal matters. That discovery lit a fuse inside me. I began knocking on doors, not with anger, but with information. I shared copies of what I'd found. Some residents didn't want to get involved, afraid of retaliation. Others were already furious and ready to fight back. Within days, a small group of us formed an informal committee, not to replace the board, but to keep them accountable. We called ourselves the Homeowners Watch. We met in my living room on a cool Wednesday night. I remember the sound of paper shuffling, pens tapping on notepads, the smell of strong coffee filling the air. We went over our evidence. It wasn't just my fine. It was dozens of them, all issued within the same month, each escalating unnaturally fast. The pattern was unmistakable. The HOA was creating a debt crisis out of thin air, turning ordinary neighbors into defaulters. And the one detail that tied it all together? The same law firm handled every single collection, billing homeowners directly for administrative handling fees. I followed the paper trail. The firm's address was the same one listed for one of the board members. That's when I realized what we were really dealing with. Conflict of interest, possibly even corruption. The thought sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. It was exploitation hidden behind regulation. By Friday, the day of the vote, I was ready. I printed everything in triplicate, my payment receipts, the bylaws, the proof of undisclosed amendments, and the link between the law firm and the board member. I slipped the documents into a binder thick enough to make a statement. The community clubhouse lights glowed like a courthouse that night. Cars lined the street, residents filed in, whispering, anxious. For the first time, the crowd outnumbered the board. The president of the board, a man whose smile no longer reached his eyes, stood at the head of the room. The meeting began, formal and cold. The delinquency list was the last item on the agenda, as if placed there to wear people down. But by the time it came, the air was charged. I watched as they called my name, stating the unpaid fine and recommending a lien authorization. My pulse drummed in my ears, but I stayed calm. I stood, stepped forward, and handed my binder to the secretary, the one person on the board I still trusted. Every eye followed the movement of that binder. The room went silent, except for the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights. The secretary flipped through the pages. Her face stiffened. I could see it, the unease, the realization that this was no ordinary complaint. I had provided evidence of double billing, procedural violations, and unethical self-dealing. For a moment, the president tried to maintain composure, but the tension was spreading like cracks through glass. Homeowners started murmuring, their curiosity ignited. They demanded to know what was inside those pages. One by one, questions began to rise from the audience. The meeting spiraled. It didn't end with a vote that night. Instead, the board adjourned early, claiming they needed to review the documents. But I knew that meant only one thing. They were rattled. Still, I didn't relax. The next morning, I woke to find an anonymous note taped to my mailbox. It was short, printed, unsigned, a warning. "You're making enemies. Stop before it gets worse." My fingers trembled as I read it. Fear and anger collided inside me. I knew I had struck a nerve, but I also realized this was bigger than I thought. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for everyone they had wronged. The following days blurred into a whirlwind of phone calls and research. I spoke to a local real estate attorney who confirmed that what the HOA was doing could be illegal if the community hadn't approved those bylaw changes. He advised me to gather signatures, to call for a special homeowners meeting. That was the only way to challenge the board's authority directly. I printed petitions, distributed them discreetly. By midweek, half the neighborhood had signed. Some dropped by after dark to hand me their forms, whispering that they were scared of retaliation. I reassured them. Once we did this together, they couldn't target us individually. The pressure on the board began to mount. Their confidence cracked. They sent a letter postponing the lien vote indefinitely, claiming to reevaluate policies. It was a small victory, but I didn't celebrate yet. I knew they were regrouping. I knew the game wasn't over. That weekend, while sorting through my binder again, I found something I'd missed before. A section of meeting minutes from 3 months earlier. It mentioned a special expense fund drawn from late fees and enforcement penalties. The amount? Over $48,000. No breakdown, no documentation, no community approval. It was labeled simply as miscellaneous maintenance. My jaw tightened. $48,000 had vanished into vague accounting, and if I was right, that fund was being siphoned under the same legal firm's name that handled our fines. They weren't just threatening auctions, they were profiting from them. That discovery was the final spark. I knew what had to be done. I gathered our committee and shared the documents. The mood in my living room was electric. People who once stayed silent now looked ready to fight. We agreed. The next homeowners meeting wouldn't be quiet. We would demand transparency, financial disclosure, and resignation of the corrupt members. By the time I turned off the lights that night, the tension in the air was thick. Outside, the neighborhood looked peaceful. Porch lights glowing, sprinklers hissing in the lawns. But I knew beneath that calm lay a storm about to break. The HOA had pushed too far. They had awakened something they couldn't control anymore. Unity. As I stood by the window, looking out at the familiar street where children played and neighbors waved, I felt both exhausted and determined. I realized this wasn't just about my home anymore. It was about fairness, about principle, about drawing a line no one else dared to draw. The next meeting would decide everything: the future of the board, the reputation of the neighborhood, and maybe even the fate of my own house. The fine that started it all was now irrelevant. What mattered was what it had revealed, the truth hiding behind those manicured lawns and polite smiles. When I finally closed my curtains that night, I knew exactly what I was going to do. I wasn't going to wait for the HOA to come after me again. I was going to expose them. The morning of the next homeowners meeting arrived heavy with anticipation. I woke before sunrise, unable to sleep, the weight of everything pressing on my chest. The binder lay open on my kitchen table, its pages marked with sticky notes and highlights. Every line of every document told the same story. Corruption masked as procedure, greed disguised as governance. The HOA board had pushed too far, and tonight it would all come to light. I stood by the window, sipping my coffee, watching the neighborhood wake up. Lawns shimmered with dew, sprinklers hissed, and for a moment everything looked peaceful, the illusion that had fooled us for so long. But beneath that calm was a restless current of distrust. Neighbors who used to wave politely now exchanged cautious looks. The words auction, liens, and lawsuit had become part of our small-town vocabulary. And at the center of it all stood one truth. A $25 fine had exposed the rot at the heart of our HOA. By midday, I double-checked every detail. Copies of the missing $48,000 fund, screenshots of the law firm connection, and printed petitions signed by dozens of residents, all neatly arranged in folders. My living room looked more like a legal war room than a home. The meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m., but by 6, cars had already begun to line the street outside the clubhouse. People were showing up early, nervous, curious, angry. I could feel the energy from blocks away as I walked down the sidewalk, binder clutched tightly in my hands. The air felt thick with unspoken tension, like the moments before a storm. When I entered the clubhouse, the sight caught me off guard. Every seat was taken. People stood along the walls, some recording with their phones, others holding copies of the petition we'd circulated. The hum of whispered conversations filled the room. For once, the board didn't seem confident. The president sat rigidly in his chair, eyes darting between the crowd and his notes. The treasurer avoided eye contact altogether. This wasn't just a meeting anymore, it was a reckoning. The agenda began as always: roll call, financial updates, maintenance reports. But everyone knew why they were there. When the floor opened for community comments, dozens of hands rose at once. One by one, neighbors began to speak, calm but firm, recounting their own experiences with arbitrary fines, hidden fees, and threats. It was surreal to witness. The same people who once feared the board were now standing up to it. Each testimony added fuel to the fire. By the time I stepped forward, the room had shifted entirely. The fear was gone. What replaced it was conviction. I placed my binder on the podium. My heart raced, but my voice stayed steady. I described the pattern of false fines, the bylaw amendments passed in secret, and the missing funds. I presented printed records of the special expense account, showing thousands of dollars diverted under vague categories. Then came the revelation that silenced the room. The legal firm handling our collections was owned by the board treasurer's cousin, and payments had been routed through that connection for months. The crowd erupted in disbelief. People gasped, others shouted questions, and the board members sat frozen. The president's confident facade cracked completely. The treasurer turned pale. I could see their plans collapsing in real time. Within minutes, the murmurs grew into calls for answers, for resignation, for an audit, for justice. A few residents demanded to see the financial books immediately. The board tried to adjourn the meeting, but the crowd refused to leave. Someone began chanting, "Open the books!" And soon half the room joined in. The sound was thunderous. The board members huddled briefly, whispering among themselves. Finally, the secretary, the only honest one among them, stood and announced that she would call for an emergency vote of the homeowners to suspend the current board, pending an investigation. That was all it took. The residents clapped, some even cheered. The board president's expression turned cold, but he had no defense left. That night changed everything. In the days that followed, the HOA drama that had started with a $25 fine spread like wildfire across the neighborhood. Word traveled fast, from doorsteps to social media, from community chats to local news. People were furious, but they were also relieved. For once, the truth was visible. The board members who had abused their power were removed by majority vote. An independent auditor was brought in to review the association's finances, and within weeks, the missing funds were traced, misused, redirected, and covered up through fraudulent accounting. When the report came out, it confirmed everything I'd suspected. The law firm had indeed billed homeowners excessively and funneled a portion of those fees back into administrative compensation, directly benefiting 2 board members. It wasn't just unethical, it was criminal. The city attorney's office opened an inquiry soon after. The same people who once sent me threatening letters were now the ones being served with official ones. But the victory wasn't just about punishment. It was about change. The community restructured the entire HOA from the ground up. New elections were held, new members sworn in. Real neighbors this time, not power-hungry opportunists. Transparency became the cornerstone. All expenses were published online. Every bylaw change required a community vote, and the threat of secret fines disappeared overnight. The mood of the neighborhood transformed. Lawns still grew, driveways still cracked, but people smiled again. We went from fear to trust, from silence to participation. And every time I walked past the clubhouse, I felt a quiet pride. We had reclaimed what was ours. As for me, I never received another fine. The $25 that started it all was officially voided, the lien withdrawn, and my record cleared. But more than that, I had gained something I never expected: perspective. I realized how fragile fairness can be, how easily power can twist something meant for community into something corrosive. Sometimes all it takes to stop corruption is one person refusing to bow down. Months later, as I stood on my porch one golden evening, the same street bathed in calm sunlight, I thought back to that first letter. It was strange how such a small piece of paper could ignite such a war. The mailbox that once filled me with dread now felt like a symbol, not of control, but of voice, of the power to fight back. I watched neighbors walk their dogs, kids riding bikes down the same path I once feared losing. The air felt lighter now. Justice has a way of cleansing even the ugliest stains. When people ask what happened, how I managed to stop the HOA, I tell them it wasn't me alone. It was all of us. Every homeowner who signed, every neighbor who spoke, every voice that refused to stay quiet. Together, we stopped them cold. The fine that began as a petty threat had turned into the very spark that exposed an empire built on greed, and when the empire fell, what remained was something far stronger, a community that finally understood its own power. That's the thing about corruption. It hides behind rules until someone dares to read them, and once you see the truth, you can never unsee it. As the sun dipped below the rooftops, I smiled, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't felt in months. The storm had passed, my home was safe, and the people who tried to take it from me, they learned what happens when ordinary homeowners fight back. Because sometimes it's not the size of the fine that matters, it's the size of the mistake they make by underestimating you.